The canyon walls of Hesperus-9 rose 300 meters on either side, casting James Archer's survey path in perpetual shadow. The planet's small sun provided enough light to work by, but the geological formations kept temperatures cool even at local midday. James preferred it this way: the solitude, the quiet, the simple rhythm of collecting samples and recording data. 3 years on frontier worlds, moving from one survey assignment to the next, and he'd almost convinced himself that this was what he wanted. Almost. His portable scanner indicated unusual mineral compositions ahead, which technically didn't matter since Hesperus-9 wasn't slated for mining development, but cataloging was cataloging. He'd learned to lose himself in the details: grain size, crystalline structure, elemental ratios. Numbers didn't ask difficult questions or look at him with pity. That's when he saw the wall. At first he thought it was a natural formation. The canyon was full of interesting erosion patterns, but as he approached, the deliberate structure became obvious. Smooth curves, too regular to be random weathering. Fitted stones, too precise to be accident. Architecture. James stopped walking, his scientific training warring with the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. Hesperus-9 was classified as presentient development, microbial life. Plant analogs, nothing that built structures. He activated his comm unit. Base, this is Archer. I'm 40 clicks southwest at coordinates. He paused, looking at the ruins that shouldn't exist. I'm going to need to file an amended survey report. We have evidence of previous habitation. The automated response informed him his message had been logged and would be reviewed within standard processing time, approximately 6 hours. James approached the wall, running his gloved hand over stone that had been shaped by intelligent hands, and felt the familiar ache of discovery mixed with isolation. Once, he would have called Emma immediately, would have recorded a message describing the find in the excited voice he used when explaining new discoveries to his daughter, would have promised to bring her a sample when he came home, but Emma had been gone for 3 years, and there was no one waiting for his calls anymore. He pushed the thought away and focused on the ruins. Professional assessment. The construction was sophisticated, the materials local stone and some kind of organic binder that had held up remarkably well. Age was difficult to determine without proper analysis, but the weathering patterns suggested decades rather than centuries. The entrance was partially collapsed but navigable. James hesitated. Proper protocol said wait for backup, establish safety parameters, don't risk lone exploration of unknown structures. But proper protocol also assumed you had backup available within reasonable timeframes, and he was 40 clicks from base, with the next supply drop not scheduled for 3 days. He activated his headlamp and entered. The interior corridors showed the same organic design principles: curves instead of corners, spaces that flowed naturally rather than following rigid geometric plans. Living spaces, clearly though small. Individual chambers branching off a central passage. Communal areas with evidence of food preparation, though any organic materials had long since degraded. A settlement for maybe 20 individuals, James estimated. Small family group or research outpost, abandoned but not destroyed. Possessions left behind suggested hasty departure rather than planned evacuation. That's when he heard it. The sound was so unexpected that for a moment his mind couldn't process it. A soft, broken sound that his pattern recognition interpreted as crying, even though that was impossible because this place had been abandoned for. He followed the sound to a chamber near the back of the complex and found her. She was small, curled in a corner where 2 curved walls met, and she was definitely crying. James's headlamp caught her face, mostly humanoid features, but the skin had a faint shimmer like oil on water, and her eyes were enormous and entirely black. Her ears swept back from her head in delicate curves that trembled as she made those heartbreaking sounds. A child, an alien child, alone in abandoned ruins on a planet that wasn't supposed to have sentient life. "Hey," James said softly, and she flinched at the sound of his voice, pressing herself harder against the wall. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him with those impossibly large eyes, and James felt something crack in the careful emotional armor he'd built over 3 years. This terrified child was someone's daughter, someone who'd left her here or lost her here, and she'd been alone for how long? Days, weeks. He crouched slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "I know you can't understand me, but I'm going to help you, okay? I'm going to get you somewhere safe." She made a small sound, not quite a word, but vocalization that suggested she was listening even if she didn't comprehend. James pulled a ration bar from his pack, broke off a piece, and held it out at arm's length. "Are you hungry?" She didn't move for a long moment. Then, with sudden desperation, she snatched the food and retreated back to her corner, cramming it into her mouth with the frantic energy of near starvation. He gave her the rest of the bar, then another, watching as she ate with single-minded intensity. When she finally slowed down, he tried again. "My name is James. Can you tell me your name?" She looked at him but made no verbal response. He tried in Calrathi, one of the alien languages he'd learned during xenobiology training, then in Sharkai, then in the clicking consonants of Krell. Nothing sparked recognition. "Okay," he said, switching back to standard. "We'll figure out communication later. Right now, let's get you somewhere warmer and safer than this." He stood slowly and held out his hand. She watched the gesture with obvious confusion but made no move to take it. James thought about Emma, about the hand-holding games they'd played when she was small, about how physical contact was a language that transcended words. He reached into his pack and pulled out his jacket, unnecessary in the climate-controlled survey suit, but he'd brought it for the weight of familiar comfort. He held it out to her. "For you, it's warm." She stared at the jacket, then at him, then slowly reached out and touched the fabric. When nothing bad happened, she pulled it closer, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was far too large, drowning her small frame, but she clutched it with both hands. "Good," James said. "That's good. Now I need to take you back to my shelter. It's a walk, but I'll carry you if you'll let me." He gestured to show carrying, and she seemed to understand. But when he moved closer, she scrambled backward again, fear overriding whatever tentative trust they'd built. "Okay, no carrying, but we need to leave this place." He pointed to the exit, then back to her. "Come with me." It took 20 minutes of patient coaxing, but eventually she followed him out of the ruins and into the canyon. She stayed several meters behind, ready to bolt at any moment, but she followed. The walk back to his shelter took twice as long as it should have. The child, James found himself thinking of her as a child, not as an alien specimen or a xenological finding, couldn't match his pace and needed frequent rest stops. But she kept following, kept trusting him just enough to keep going. When they finally reached the prefab shelter, James realized he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He was a xenobiologist who studied ecosystems and microorganisms. He had no training in caring for sentient beings, no experience with whatever species this child belonged to, no framework for this situation except the fading memories of fatherhood that he'd tried so hard to bury. But she was standing in his shelter, wrapped in his jacket, looking at him with exhausted hope, and James knew he couldn't turn away. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. "Let's figure this out together." He activated the food synthesizer, running through options until he found something that matched the nutritional profile of what she'd eaten at the ruins. She devoured it. He set up a sleeping area in the corner, using spare blankets to create something soft and enclosed. She claimed it immediately, curling up with obvious relief. And as James sat at his workstation, preparing the report he'd need to file about this discovery, he watched her sleep and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. The particular kind of fear that comes from being responsible for another person's well-being. He'd named her Nova in his head already, though he was careful not to say it aloud. Naming her felt like claiming her, and he had no right to do that. But as he watched her small form rise and fall with breath, As he began to understand that his life had just become impossibly complicated, James allowed himself to acknowledge one truth. For the first time since Emma's death, he felt like something other than a ghost going through familiar motions. He felt needed, and that terrified him more than any alien ruins ever could. The first week established routines through trial and error. Nova, James had stopped fighting the private name, though he didn't use it where his reports might pick it up, learned his schedule quickly. She woke when he did, followed him through morning equipment checks, stayed close during meal preparation. She remained silent. James tried everything he could think of to elicit speech, showing her picture books from his personal files, playing audio recordings of different languages, even attempting basic sign language. She watched everything with intense attention, clearly intelligent and understanding, but produced no vocalizations beyond occasional sounds of distress or contentment. The Colonial Survey Authority's response to his discovery had been predictable: maintain observation, avoid cultural contamination, await specialized team. Standard first contact protocols, as if this situation bore any resemblance to standard anything. James had framed his initial reports carefully, emphasizing the xenological significance while downplaying the humanitarian crisis. A child alone in ruins was unfortunate, but fell into ethical gray areas about interference. A previously unknown sentient species represented potential concordance contact, which had different protocols entirely. He bought himself 6 weeks. 6 weeks before specialists arrived to make decisions about Nova's future that he had no authority to influence. In the meantime, he did his best to care for her. He learned through observation that she could digest most of the food the synthesizer produced, though she preferred items with more complex carbohydrates. She seemed comfortable at slightly warmer temperatures than human standard. She slept more than human children, 10 to 12 hours daily, but woke frequently during those periods as if from nightmares. When she had nightmares, she sought him out. The first time it happened, James woke to find her standing beside his sleeping pad, silently crying. He'd sat up and she'd immediately crawled into his lap, shaking. He'd held her until she calmed, stroking her hair in the way he used to comfort Emma, and tried not to think about how familiar this felt, how much it hurt, how much it helped. During his second week with Nova, James returned to the ruins. He brought portable analysis equipment and spent 3 days documenting everything he could find. The settlement had been home to a small group, 22 individuals based on sleeping arrangements and personal effects. They'd lived here for perhaps 2 years before the hasty abandonment. What he couldn't find was any clue about where they'd gone or why they'd left a child behind. The wall markings were the key, though interpretation was challenging. His translation software struggled with the language, providing fragmentary results that raised more questions than answers. Phrases about inheritors and genetic memory, and something his software rendered as father pattern recognition. He photographed everything, uploaded it to his secure research files, and tried to focus on data rather than speculation. Back at the shelter, Nova had developed a new habit. She'd found the photo James kept on his workstation. It was Emma, age 6, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a jar containing some kind of beetle she'd been absolutely delighted to discover. James had nearly packed it away a dozen times over the past 3 years, but he never quite managed it. Some grief was meant to be visible. Nova touched the photo with one finger, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at James and made a soft questioning sound. "That's Emma," he said, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "My daughter. She died 3 years ago in a shuttle accident. She was 7. Nova tilted her head, still looking between the photo and James. Then she did something unexpected. She placed her hand on her own chest, then pointed to the photo, then to James. "I don't understand what you're trying to tell me," James admitted. She repeated the gesture more insistently. Hand to chest, point to photo, point to James, and then she opened her mouth and made a deliberate attempt to form a word. No sound came out, but James could see the effort, the frustration when her vocal cords wouldn't cooperate. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to speak. We'll figure out other ways to communicate." But she kept trying, her whole body tensing with effort, and James realized this wasn't about communication. This was about something urgent, something she desperately needed him to understand. He just had no idea what it was. That night Nova had the worst nightmare yet. James woke to her screaming, the first loud sound he'd heard her make, and found her thrashing in her sleeping area, clearly caught in some terror her mind couldn't escape. He gathered her into his arms despite the risk of frightening her further, held her firmly but gently, and spoke in the calm voice he'd perfected during Emma's occasional night terrors. "You're safe. I've got you. You're safe, Nova. I'm here." She clung to him with desperate strength, her small body shaking, and gradually the screaming subsided into broken sobs. "Whatever you're remembering, it can't hurt you now," James continued. "You're here with me, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." It took nearly an hour for her to calm completely. When she finally relaxed into exhausted sleep, still in his arms, James found himself crying for the first time since Emma's funeral. This child wasn't his daughter, could never replace the daughter he'd lost. But she needed a father, and he'd failed Emma by not being there when she needed him most, and maybe, this was the universe giving him another chance to show up when it mattered. He held Nova through the rest of the night and made a decision he knew was probably unwise, definitely complicated, and absolutely necessary. He was going to fight to keep her, whatever that took. Week 3 brought the breakthrough that changed everything. James was preparing breakfast, a routine Nova had come to understand and even help with in small ways, like bringing him utensils or activating the food synthesizer at his nod. He was distracted, reviewing translation results on his datapad while monitoring the heating element, and he made a careless mistake. His hand brushed the element's exposed surface. Pain seared through his palm, and he cursed, jerking backward and immediately running cold water over the burn. He didn't notice Nova's approach until she was beside him, making high-pitched distressed sounds in her throat. She reached for his injured hand with obvious concern, her large eyes fixed on the reddened skin. "I'm okay," James said reflexively, the words he'd always used with Emma after minor injuries. "Just a small burn." "I should have been more careful." Nova stared at his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her mouth opened and closed, her whole body trembling, and then she spoke. "Father." The word was mangled by her alien vocal anatomy, the consonants slightly wrong and the vowel sound dragging, but it was unmistakable. James froze, cold water still running over his hand. "What did you say?" Nova's eyes were huge, frightened by her own voice, but she repeated it stronger this time, "Father." Then she pointed directly at him and said it again, "Father." The world tilted. James shut off the water with numb fingers, staring at this alien child who just called him by a title he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Nova." He stopped, realizing he'd said her name aloud for the first time. "Do you understand what that word means?" She nodded, a human gesture she must have learned from watching him, and repeated, "Father, you, father." James sank down to sit on the floor, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. Nova immediately dropped beside him, her small hand reaching for his uninjured one. "I'm not." He stopped, regrouped, tried again. "Nova, I'm human, we're different species. I can't be your biological father." She looked confused by the explanation, frustrated by limits of vocabulary. But she squeezed his hand and said with absolute certainty, "Father." Over the following days, Nova's vocabulary exploded. She learned human words with impossible speed, sometimes seeming to grasp complex concepts before James fully explained them. Her pattern of acquisition was all wrong. Children built language from simple to complex, but Nova seemed to be remembering rather than learning. And she insisted, with growing linguistic capability, on calling him father. James intensified his research into the ruins, driven by desperate need to understand. The wall markings yielded more information as his translation algorithms improved. The species was called Velen. They possessed something called genetic memory. Actual memories pass through maternal lines, fragmentary and dreamlike, but carrying knowledge across generations. The markings spoke of crisis, a dying homeworld, scattered diaspora, and a protocol encoded into the youngest generation, recognition patterns designed to help Velen children bond with protectors even across species barriers. The translation called it father pattern recognition, genetic templates that identified safe caregivers through behavioral and biochemical markers. James sat in the ruins, surrounded by ancient warnings and desperate hope encoded in stone, and understood. Nova wasn't calling him father because of confusion or attachment disorder. She was calling him father because her genetic memory, inherited from mothers stretching back through generations of Velen history, recognized patterns in his behavior. His protectiveness, his gentle speech, his patient care. Her genetics had been programmed to identify these patterns as father, as safe, as someone to trust when the universe was terrifying and incomprehensible. She'd been engineered to bond with him. The question that haunted James, was it real? If her attachment was the result of genetic programming rather than organic emotional development, did that make it less valid? Or did it matter at all when she looked at him with complete trust and whispered father, as if the word was a lifeline? He didn't have answers. But as he returned to the shelter and found Nova waiting anxiously for him, as she ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist in the greeting she'd developed, James realized something fundamental. She'd called him father, and every day since he'd been choosing to answer that call with his actions. Maybe that was enough. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived 4 weeks ahead of schedule, leading a first contact team equipped with everything except easy answers. She was professional, compassionate, and absolutely clear about the complications James had created by forming an attachment with Nova. She needs to be studied, Chen explained during their first private conversation. Not as a specimen, as a person whose species we know nothing about. We need to understand her physiology, her nutritional requirements, her developmental needs. We need to attempt to locate her people. You're a field biologist, not equipped for this. I know, James said, but she won't go willingly. They'd already attempted separation. Chen's team had tried to transport Nova to their ship for initial medical assessment, and the child had become hysterical. She'd clung to James with desperate strength, screaming, that terrible sound he'd only heard during her worst nightmares, and when they'd tried to physically separate them, she'd spoken clearly for the first time in front of others. Father, please. Don't leave, Father. The team had backed off immediately, shaken by her distress. Now Chen reviewed genetic analysis while James waited for verdict he already knew was coming. The Velen possessed genetic memory, Chen confirmed. It's remarkable, inherited memories passing through maternal lines, allowing knowledge transfer across generations. Nova's genetic markers suggest she's been encoded with specific survival protocols. Her attachment to you isn't accidental. I know, James said quietly. I found the markings in the ruins, the father pattern recognition protocol. Then you understand that her feelings are programmed. Her people encoded her with templates designed to help her bond with caregivers, even across species lines. She's responding to inherited patterns, not to you specifically. Does that make her feelings less real? James asked, the question he'd been asking himself for weeks. If she's genuinely afraid when we're separated, if she genuinely seeks comfort from me, does the source matter? Chen was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, she admitted. The ethics here are unprecedented. Is it fair to her to let her remain attached to you when you're not her biological parent? Is it fair to you to burden you with this responsibility? Is it fair to either of you to separate you when the bond, however it formed, is clearly mutual? What are my options? Legally, You could petition for guardianship status. There's precedent in concordance law for cross-species adoption when biological parents are deceased and no suitable same-species guardians exist. It's rare, but frameworks exist. And practically, you'd need extensive training in Velen physiology, what little we know of it. You'd need to establish permanent residence suitable for raising a child. You'd submit to regular welfare evaluations. And you'd be accepting responsibility for helping her understand her genetic heritage, potentially searching for surviving Velen communities, raising a child who will always be between two worlds. Chen met his eyes. It's not a temporary arrangement, James. If you do this, it's forever. Are you prepared for that? James thought about Emma, about 3 years of grief and isolation, and the careful emotional numbness he'd cultivated to survive. About the moment Nova first whispered father and cracked that numbness like ice in spring. I lost my daughter 3 years ago, he said quietly. I thought that part of me, the part that could be a father, died with her. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life going through motions, cataloging rocks on frontier worlds, existing but not really living. He looked through the observation window to where Nova sat in the adjacent room, drawing pictures with materials Chen's team had provided. She kept glancing up, checking to make sure James was still visible. Nova didn't replace Emma. She can't. They're different people, and what I feel for each of them exists in different spaces. He turned back to Chen. But she showed me that the capacity for fatherhood doesn't die. It's not tied to biology or species. It's about showing up, being present, choosing to love someone even when it's complicated and difficult and doesn't make logical sense. That's not a scientific answer, Chen observed. No, but it's a true one. James straightened his shoulders. I want to petition for guardianship. I know it's going to be hard. I know I'll make mistakes. But I made a promise when I carried her out of those ruins, maybe not in words but in actions, and I'm going to keep that promise. Chen studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll support your petition. But you should know, we found information about what happened to her biological family. James's stomach tightened. Tell me. The Velen settlement here was one of several scattered across frontier space, remnants of a diaspora from their dying homeworld. Nova's biological parents were part of a group attempting to reach a larger Velen colony in the Terran sector. Their ship suffered catastrophic failure. There were no survivors. And Nova, based on her age and the timeline, she was left here by caretakers who intended to return for her after completing the journey and establishing safe harbor. They never made it. Ship records indicate they were caught in a solar flare event. Total loss. James closed his eyes, processing the weight of what that meant. Nova was an orphan in the truest sense. No parents waiting to reclaim her. No family to return to. Just a child engineered by desperate people to survive alone, to find safety in strangers, to carry forward memories of a species scattered to the stars. She has no one, he said. She has you, Chen corrected. If you choose to be there. The guardianship petition took 6 weeks to process. During that time, James completed accelerated training in Velen physiology with specialists Chen had brought in. He learned about their 3-chambered cardiovascular system, their unique metabolism that processed both plant and animal proteins, their longer childhood development cycle that meant Nova was actually closer to 3 in human equivalent years despite her apparent age of 5 or 6. He learned about genetic memory, how it manifested in dreams and sudden knowledge, how it could be both gift and burden for children who carried memories they didn't fully understand, how Nova would need help processing images and feelings that came from her maternal line, stretching back through generations of Velen mothers, who had encoded their most precious knowledge into their daughters' very genetics. And he learned about the father protocol specifically, how the Velen had identified behavioral and biochemical markers associated with protective caregiving across multiple species, how they'd encoded recognition of these patterns into their youngest generation as a survival mechanism, How Nova's response to James wasn't random or accidental, but the result of her genetics identifying him as matching a template designed by her people to save their children's lives. Does she know? James asked one of the specialists, a Velen researcher named Kira who'd been located in the Terran sector. Does she understand that her attachment is partly genetic programming? Kira's ears tilted in the gesture James had learned meant thoughtful consideration. At her developmental stage, she experiences it as pure emotion. The genetic component is invisible to her. She simply knows you feel safe, that your presence calms her inherited anxieties, that you match the template for father that her genetics recognize. As she matures, she may come to understand the mechanism, but that understanding does not diminish the reality of the bond. How do I explain this to her someday? The same way you would explain why she has her mother's eyes or her grandmother's musical talent. Genetics shape us, but they do not define us. The bond began with recognition patterns, yes, but it continues through choice, yours and hers. Every day you choose to be her father, you make that bond real in ways that transcend programming. The guardianship was approved on a cold morning when Hesperus-9's thin atmosphere created frost patterns on the shelter windows. James received the notification through his comm, stared at the legal document that officially made him Nova's guardian, and felt the weight of it settle over him like a mantle. He'd become a father again, not through biology but through choice and paperwork and the universe's strange sense of timing. Nova found him sitting at his workstation, staring at the approval document. She climbed into his lap, a behavior she'd adopted over the past weeks, and looked at his face with concern. "Father sad?" she asked. Her language skills had progressed to simple sentences, though complex grammar still eluded her. "Not sad," James said, wrapping his arms around her. "Just feeling a lot of things at once." "What things?" How did you explain to a child, especially one still learning language, the complex mixture of grief and hope, fear and determination, the aching awareness that you'd been given a second chance you didn't deserve but were desperately grateful for? "I'm happy you're staying with me," he said simply. "I'm scared I won't always know how to help you. I'm sad that you lost your first family, and He paused, searching for the right word. "I'm honored that you chose to call me father." Nova was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she pointed to the photo of Emma that still sat on his workstation. "She your daughter, before?" "Yes." "Where's she now?" James had known this question would come eventually. He tried to prepare for it. "She died 3 years ago, an accident." Nova's expression showed understanding beyond her limited vocabulary. She touched the photo gently. "You miss her?" "Every day. I make you miss her more." Nova's voice was small, worried. "Oh, sweetheart, no." James hugged her tighter. "You don't make it worse, you make it different. I'll always miss Emma, always love her, but loving you doesn't take away from loving her. Love doesn't work like that." "I have genetic memories," Nova said carefully, clearly repeating something she'd heard from the specialists. "From many mothers before. They all different but all inside me, like Emma in you." James felt tears prick his eyes at the unexpected wisdom of the comparison. "Yeah, exactly like that. The people we love stay inside us even when they're gone. They shape who we are." Nova nodded seriously. Then she put her small hand on his chest over his heart. "Emma here, always here, I not replace, I just also here." "You are," James confirmed, his voice thick. "You're here and you're staying, and I'm going to do my best to be the father you need." "You already good father," Nova said with the simple certainty of childhood. Then she hugged him, and James held his adopted alien daughter and cried for everything he'd lost and everything he'd somehow, impossibly, found. 5 years later, the colony world of New Providence had excellent schools, comprehensive medical facilities, and a diverse population that included 17 different species. It was as close to an ideal environment for raising a cross-species family as James could find. Their home was modest, a 3-room dwelling in a residential district where neighbors included Corvathi families, human households, a Krell philosopher who kept odd hours, and a Tholian couple whose bioluminescent communication kept their windows flickering at night. James had transitioned from field research to teaching, working as a xenobiology professor at the colony's university. It allowed him to maintain his research interests while providing stability for Nova's education. Nova herself, now 10 years old in Velen development terms, roughly equivalent to a human 12-year-old, attended the colony school where her unique background made her popular among xenoanthropology students. She'd become fluent in Standard, conversational in 3 other languages, and had begun accessing deeper genetic memories that provided fragmentary knowledge of ancient Velen culture. She'd also helped locate 3 other surviving Velen communities scattered across frontier space, small groups, remnants of the diaspora, but enough to ensure her people's culture wouldn't die completely. She maintained regular contact with Kira and other Velen researchers, learning about her heritage while building a life in human society. Tonight, she sat at the kitchen table, stylus tapping against her datapad in a gesture of frustration James recognized from countless homework sessions. "This quantum mathematics unit is impossible," she announced. "Why do humans insist on teaching abstract concepts before establishing proper foundational understanding?" "Because the education system was designed by committee," James said, reviewing his own work lecture notes for tomorrow's class. "Want me to look at the problem?" She slid the datapad across the table, and they worked through the equations together. It was familiar rhythm, comfortable in its normalcy. Father helping daughter with homework, universal experience that transcended species. When they finished, Nova leaned back in her chair and asked the question James had learned meant she'd been thinking about something serious. "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" "Taking me in, becoming my guardian. Your life would have been simpler if you'd let the specialists take me." James set down his stylus and looked at his daughter. Because that's what she was, regardless of biology or genetics or the complicated path that had brought them together. "Do you want the honest answer?" "Always. Sometimes it's hard. When you have nightmares from genetic memories I can't fully understand. When I have to explain human cultural concepts that don't translate to Velen experience. When I worry that I'm not giving you enough connection to your biological heritage." He paused, "But regret, never, not once." "Why?" "Because you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. You reminded me that being a father isn't about biology or species. It's about showing up. It's about choosing to love someone and then making that choice every single day through actions, not just words." Nova was quiet, processing in the thoughtful way she developed. "Then, I accessed a deeper genetic memory last week, from my great-great-grandmother. She was one of the elders who helped design the Father Protocol." "What did you see?" "She was dying. The homeworld was dying. And she was encoding survival protocols into the youngest generation, knowing she'd never see them grow up. Knowing most of them would probably die alone on scattered worlds, far from anyone who understood them." Nova's voice was soft. She encoded the Father Protocol hoping that maybe, just maybe, some children would find safety with strangers, that the universe might have compassion in unexpected places. "That's a lot to carry," James said gently. "I know why she did it. I understand the genetic mechanism." Nova looked up, her large dark eyes serious. "But I also know that mechanism brought me to you. And that my great-great-grandmother would be grateful that her desperate hope worked. That I found a father who sees me as precious rather than as a xenological curiosity." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest, love and grief and gratitude all tangled together. "Come here, sweetheart." Nova came around the table and hugged him, and James held his daughter, his chosen daughter, his alien daughter, his daughter in every way that mattered, and marveled at the universe's strange compassion. "I love you," he said. "I loved Emma and I'll always carry her with me. But I also love you. You're not a replacement or a consolation prize. You're my daughter, and I'm grateful every day that you whispered, Father, when you didn't have words for anything else. I love you too, Nova said. Then, because she was still a child despite her genetic memories and complex heritage, she added, even when you make me do quantum mathematics homework. James laughed, really laughed, the kind of joyful sound that had been absent from his life for so long before Nova arrived. Even then, he agreed. That night, after Nova had gone to bed, James stood in the doorway of her room and watched her sleep. She decorated it with both human and Velen elements, posters of stars and genetic diagrams, drawings of alien landscapes from inherited memories, and one photo in a place of honor on her desk. It showed Emma, grinning gap-toothed at the camera, holding her beloved beetle jar. Nova had asked if she could keep it in her room, said it helped her understand where James came from, why he sometimes got quiet on certain dates, why he'd been able to recognize that a frightened child in abandoned ruins needed a father even when everything else was complicated and strange. James had given her the photo, grateful that his two daughters could coexist in his heart without competing. That love wasn't a limited resource, rationed and hoarded. That fatherhood was big enough to hold grief and joy simultaneously. He thought about the Velen elder who'd encoded survival protocols into her great-great-granddaughter's genetics, desperate and dying and hoping for miracles. Thought about Nova alone in those ruins, carrying inherited memories and survival templates, waiting for someone to recognize what she needed. Thought about his own journey from isolated grief to this moment, standing in a doorway on a colony world, watching an alien child sleep peacefully, feeling like a father again. The universe's oldest language wasn't words or biology or genetic programming. It was choice. The decision to show up when someone needed you, to call someone precious and mean it, to build family from love rather than obligation. Nova stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in ancient Velen that James's translator couldn't quite catch. But he didn't need translation to understand. She was dreaming of mothers stretching back through time, of a dying world and desperate hopes, of genetic codes carrying love across generations and species barriers. And she was dreaming of waking up tomorrow in a home